Hello all, and welcome to Let's Read Is God a Delusion by Eric Reitan. In this video series, I read through and respond to this liberal Christian apologetics book from my skeptical lay perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover all of chapter 4, Science, Transcendence and Meaning. So, I was expecting this chapter to be the start of Reitan's arguments in support of his position, but I was mistaken. And this is actually the fourth and last chapter in defining his terms. The point of this chapter, as its title suggests, is to explain how a transcendent reality relates to scientific investigation. The chapter starts with Reitan considering the reason that we don't believe in Santa. He puts it like this: belief in the existence of some entity is legitimate only given sufficient evidence for its existence. In the absence of such evidence, the proper stance is disbelief. And so, in the absence of evidence for God's existence, we should treat God just as we treat Santa, as a pleasing fiction. This is a good summary of the argument against believing in God. Reitan then segues into talking about Russell's teapot. Bertrand Russell, in a 1952 essay, introduced the idea of a teapot that orbits the Sun somewhere between the Earth and Mars. In his example, Russell further specifies that his teapot happens to be beyond our capability to detect, using telescopes or other instruments. This teapot was Russell's way of talking about the idea of unfalsifiable beliefs. That is, things that can be proposed but cannot be shown to be false. His point was that such things should be disbelieved as they lack evidence for them. That is, the burden of proof rests with the claimant, and by definition, an unfalsifiable claim has no evidence. Reitan puts the skeptic's argument like this: belief in God is no different from belief in a celestial teapot. In either case, if there is no credible evidence for the existence of this extraordinary entity, you should not merely be agnostic. Even though you can't disprove its existence, you should still disbelieve. If you don't, you're as superstitious as those who believe in leprechauns. I suspect that Reitan here is using the term agnostic as a midpoint on the spectrum between the theist who asserts that God exists and an atheist who asserts that God does not. This usage, while not universally accepted, is in somewhat common usage. On this usage, an agnostic is what many would call a weak atheist, someone who doesn't say God doesn't exist, but just lacks a conviction that he does. So many atheists would agree with Reitan here, if not with his terminology. Reitan's point here is that if science finds no evidence for a God, shouldn't we conclude that such a God doesn't exist? Of course, he actually agrees with this on the question of every other God concept, but on his definition of God, he wants to argue that a lack of evidence is not actually evidence against its existence. Religion versus superstition. This section begins with an overview of all the scientific evidence against the existence of Santa. The idea is that whether Santa exists is certainly, at least in principle, within the purview of science. Reitan also discusses how Russell's teapot, fairies, and giant space lobsters would also be, in principle, detectable by science. He summarises it like this: there are at least 3 properties shared by belief in Santa, the celestial teapot, garden fairies, space lobsters, and the rest. First, they are beliefs that can, in principle, be tested empirically. While they might not be falsifiable in a strong sense, they are in principle verifiable. Second, given what we know about the empirical world, partly from science, we have no good reason to think these beliefs are true, and at least some reason to think them false. Thus, the burden of proof clearly falls on the defenders of these beliefs. Finally, this burden has not been met, with respect to Santa, or Russell's teapot, or garden fairies, etc. There are a couple of problems with this. Firstly, Reitan is suggesting that the burden of proof rests with the proponents of such beliefs simply because science can investigate them and have found them wanting. This is a misunderstanding. The burden of proof always rests with the claimant, regardless of the status of science. Another problem is that Reitan is suggesting that, while these beliefs are amenable to empirical testing, other beliefs are not. He's focused so far on Santa, Russell's teapot, and space lobsters, which are all traditionally understood as having a relatively mundane physical existence, and so intuitively seem scientifically testable. That is, he seems to be subtly suggesting that science can only test claims about material reality, which is false. Reitan goes on to label any such belief that satisfies these 3 criteria, empirically verifiable, not in line with science, and lacking sufficient evidence, as superstition, which is annoying, as he's already used superstition in a different way. His point here is that many traditionally religious beliefs probably fall into this category, and he's comfortable jettisoning all of them. What he wants to argue, though, is that belief in God need not fall into this category. He goes on to explain that his definition of God, that which fulfills our ethico-religious hope, necessitates that God is outside of the purview of science. That is, they're about having a reality beyond the empirical, or that transcends scientific inquiry. He describes what he means by religious beliefs as such. Distinctly religious beliefs, then, are meaning-bestowing beliefs about a transcendent reality, and that is very different from superstition as I've defined it here. With respect to superstition, the absence of scientific evidence is a compelling reason to disbelieve. But when it comes to meaning-bestowing beliefs about the transcendent, things are considerably more complicated. This is his summary of this section, so he hasn't actually defended these claims yet. And his usage of the term religious beliefs is odd, as it conflicts with the way that he's explicitly defined religion in chapter 1. There, he defined religion as a profound emotional experience akin to awe, and defined beliefs about the nature of such experiences as theology. But theology in chapter 1 could include purely naturalistic explanations, so they hardly count as meaning-bestowing beliefs about a transcendent reality, except in a trivial sense that they assert that such a thing doesn't exist. What I think he really means here is that believing that his God exists is a statement about a transcendent reality, as his God does not exist within the realm of science. Since he's defined God as the being that fulfills our ethico-religious hope, then it naturally follows that a belief in such a God will be meaning-bestowing. I just wish he'd been more careful in his use of the terminology he spent 4 chapters explaining. Virgin Mary sightings. This next section starts with Reitan recounting one of the many apparent sightings of the image of the Virgin Mary, this one in a lump of melted chocolate in a chocolate factory. The person who found this piece of chocolate was a factory worker named Cruz Jacinto, and Reitan describes her belief in it like this. But whatever we think about the chocolate, few would deny that Cruz Jacinto's belief that this chocolate image was a sign from God is religious. It's not a religious belief I happen to share. In fact, I think there are reasons to be sceptical of it, but science's role in evaluating this belief is decidedly limited. Note here that again Reitan has described this as a religious belief, which is at odds with his definitions. He is equivocating between using the term religious in the way that he has gone to pains to define it, and the more colloquial sense. This would be fine if he had not lambasted others for not defining and sticking to their terms. The bigger problem here is in his claim that science has little to say about such religious beliefs. After this passage, he goes on to explain that even though we can give a complete naturalistic account of such sightings of the Virgin Mary, and that such an account is almost certainly correct, this doesn't undermine the religious claims about such occurrences. His claim is that when someone says that the image of the Virgin Mary appeared in their toast, they are not making an empirical claim, but rather a claim about transcendent reality. But religious people often are making empirical claims, just claims that turn out to be false. Such sightings are often claimed to be miracles, or somehow caused by God. And science has shown that they are not miraculous, and that no God caused them. They are no more or less a sign of God than the shape of a flower in my garden. Of course, Reitan ignores these common claims, and instead focuses on the transcendent nature of God. Schleiermacher and the Transcendence of God. Here, Reitan defines what he means by transcendence. And the basic idea is that all of reality that we can, in principle, test empirically is not transcendent. Anything else is transcendent. That is, a transcendent reality is, in principle and by definition, inaccessible to science. Reitan references Schleiermacher to explain it. Schleiermacher maintains that we have 2 basic kinds of experiences: receptive ones, in which the world affects us, and active ones, in which we affect the world. The former are accompanied by what he calls the feeling of dependence, basically how it feels to be acted upon. The latter are accompanied by the feeling of freedom, that is, how it feels to act. He goes on to say that everything in the empirical world is characterized by us having both of these experiences. That is, there is nothing in the empirical world to which we are either purely active or purely passive. He elaborates that even when we are idly contemplating the universe, we're still active in doing so, as we have chosen to do so. He goes on to argue that if we have an experience of what Schleiermacher calls absolute dependence, purely being acted upon, then this cannot come from the empirical world. That is, it must transcend empirical reality, and that's what Schleiermacher calls God. The problems here are many. Reitan gives no justification for why all experiences of the empirical world are always a mixture of both kinds of experience, or even that such experiences actually exist and are meaningful. This is, at worst, begging the question, and at best, a poor argument by analogy. As best I can make it out, the argument is this. When we have mundane experiences, they seem to come in two kinds, and all mundane experiences contain a mix of both kinds. Therefore, any experience that is of only one kind is not mundane. He glosses over the possibility that such kinds of experiences might actually be meaningless, or delusional, or simply reflective of the empirical world of our own brain. He just asserts that it must be a sign of the transcendent, as if human feelings and subjective experiences are reliable evidence of extraordinary claims about reality. The other major problem here is that he just assumes that any such transcendent reality must be his God. Remember, he is not free, as Schleiermacher does, to just label any transcendent thing as God. Reitan has already defined God as that which fulfills our ethico-religious hope. So he actually needs to show that the feeling of absolute dependence actually is evidence of such a God. He presents no reasons here. Reitan closes this section by claiming that because, on his account, a feeling of absolute dependence can only come from a transcendent being, his God is therefore immune to scientific scrutiny. On this he is quite wrong, but I'll wait for him to present his argument before I rebut it. Brains in vats. This next section, as its title suggests, is about the brain in a vat thought experiment from philosophy. The basic idea is this. Suppose that a mad scientist removed your brain and placed it in a suitable vat of life-supporting liquid, and then hooked your brain up to a supercomputer that has simulated all of the sensory inputs and motor outputs from your brain. In doing this, any memory of the transition is erased, so that from your brain's perspective, it is still living in the real world. If the computer simulation of the world is good enough, then there's no way that your brain, that is you, can know if you are a real person or just a brain in a vat. This thought experiment has a long philosophical pedigree and has been used to highlight problems with various philosophical positions. Here, Reitan uses it to distinguish between what he's termed the empirical world and transcendent reality. He imagines if everyone were brains in vats, including all scientists. Quote, "If we grant all of this, there would be no reason for the scientists investigating this world to ever suspect they're just brains in vats. The question of whether they are brains in vats pertains to a reality that falls, in principle, outside the empirical scope of their science." This is a reasonable delineation. If the simulation is absolutely perfect, so that nothing of the reality of the vats and computer is discernible to the brains, then it is true that such a reality is outside the scope of empirical science, as done by the brains in the vats. In this scenario, Reitan calls the reality of the computers and the brains, as opposed to the simulated reality, transcendent. What science can and cannot say about the transcendent. Having illustrated his concept of transcendence with the brains in vats scenario, Reitan turns to the question of whether a transcendent God may still be detectable by science. He reviews Victor Stenger's analysis in his book God, the Failed Hypothesis, that regardless of whether God is transcendent or not, if he interacts with the world, then this would render such a God subject to empirical testing. The idea is that regardless of his claimed nature, any God that intervenes in the world, say to answer prayers, can be detected through his effect on the world. Of course, Reitan acknowledges that any such God has been falsified, as there are no phenomena that require God as an explanation. Stenger's argument, according to Reitan, is that since God is supposed to sustain and participate in all of reality through his omnipresence, then surely he should be detectable everywhere. As Reitan puts it, so what exactly follows from the fact that no scientific explanation of the observable world requires us to posit a divine creator and sustainer of the universe? Does it tell us that no such being exists? Hardly. It only tells us that if such a being exists, it has created and sustains a seamlessly unified empirical reality with perfectly explicable laws. Reitan argues that God is like the supercomputer in the brain in a vat scenario. Despite the computer sustaining and participating in every aspect of the simulation, there's still no way that people inside the simulation can detect it. He goes on to further this analogy, and in doing so concedes there is no evidence for the effectiveness of petitionary prayer. That is, God does not seem to answer prayers. The point that Reitan is making is that many claims about transcendent gods are still falsifiable, and he seems to accept that they have been falsified. However, he wants to reserve a space for certain religious beliefs as not being falsifiable in this sense. At this point in the section, he returns to the example of the Virgin Mary appearing in a lump of chocolate, and explains why he doesn't believe it is actually a sign from God. Why? Essentially, because he doesn't believe in an interventionist God who sculpts chocolate, because such a God would also prevent needless deaths of children. While it is interesting that he does recognise that God seems to do little to prevent much suffering of innocents, it is also interesting that he thinks a God that doesn't prevent child death wouldn't leave signs for us. But in what relevant way is the Virgin Mary in a piece of toast different from an emotional experience of awe? Why would a God who would intervene to give us religious experiences not also occasionally put his image in food? Reitan goes on to make an argument from ignorance of the kind that he decried last chapter. There, he criticised the argument that while something seems immoral to us, there may still be a good moral explanation from God's perspective. Here, he advances the argument that while it seems that empirical reality is all that exists for us, there may still be a transcendent reality. Again, without evidence for it, to believe in it would be irrational. The section closes with Reitan summarising and finally defining what he means by the term religious belief. It turns out that what he means is simply the idea that some empirical phenomenon is the work of God, even if it proceeds by natural laws. Nice to finally have a definition, and I'm interested to know how he thinks he can show that any such belief is rational. The God of the chance gaps. This section starts with Reitan explaining that at heart, science is a search for consistent patterns in the way the universe operates. He gives a good explanation of the way that science progresses by discovering deeper and broader explanations for the regularities of nature. Although he acknowledges that the search for such explanations has been incredibly successful, he can't resist saying that scientists have faith in science, although it's hardly faith to expect success after a long history of success. The point Reitan is making here is that if the universe is purely governed by natural laws with no room for outside influences, where does that leave God? To answer this, Reitan uses the example of a child with leukemia. If God wants the disease to go away, should he intervene through miraculous means, even though this undermines the natural laws? Reitan answers it like this. All else being equal, it seems to me a good God would want the very thing that scientists want. Such a God would want us to live in a predictable world, one that works according to rules that we can come to understand and rely on. God would want us to be able to use that understanding to help others, so that the quest for knowledge could itself become an act of love. This seems to mean that God can't force the cancer into remission, but Reitan puts forward two ways that God could still intervene. Firstly, God could arrange things so that such a cure is simply the result of the orderly processes of the universe. But Reitan doesn't like this option since it removes human free will. The other option is that God could intervene purely on a spiritual level. That is, he could simply alleviate the child's emotional suffering while allowing the disease to progress as normal. Reitan also doesn't like this option, as he wants his God to be able to intervene in the physical world. A third option that Reitan comes up with is that God could simply perform a miracle, but do this so rarely that it doesn't undermine our sense of a predictable universe. Reitan doesn't like this option because he thinks he has a better solution. The solution that Reitan has to how God can intervene in the world without undermining natural laws is that God can make subtle adjustments to the probabilities of random events, or what he calls chance gaps. That is, since there are many situations where physical laws don't determine the precise outcome, but rather a range of possible outcomes, some of these events could be the result of divine choice rather than pure randomness. He goes further, returning to the brains in vat scenario. In that situation, the brains themselves are not actually part of the simulation. They transcend it. To Reitan, this suggests that they could exercise their free will in the simulation by influencing random events within it. This is an analogy for the idea that human free will comes from a transcendent soul that, similar to God, can influence the outcomes of random events. Reitan summarises it like this. The point here is this. The transcendence of a crucial element of the human person, the soul, may offer a solution to the puzzle of free agency, but only when combined with something like the space for action that chance gaps allow. the very chance gaps that quantum physics confirms as an ineradicable feature of the natural world. But once we make that space for ourselves, we also make it for God. There is a lot wrong with this idea. Firstly, quantum physics has not established that randomness is an ineradicable feature of the world. There are interpretations of quantum mechanics that are entirely deterministic without any randomness. The best that can be said is that quantum mechanics has established that you cannot have both determinism and causality, but it hasn't adjudicated which of these must go. We just tend to prefer causality over determinism if we're forced to choose. Secondly, almost all of what is thought of as random processes aren't. Earthquakes are entirely deterministic, with no actual random elements. Similarly for weather patterns, or the motion of a flipped coin. We think of these as random because that's a good model for them from our limited perspective, but they aren't actually random events. Even if quantum mechanics is random, the quantum effects are negligible at large scales. The same can be said for childhood leukemia. There simply is no chance gap for God to intervene in without violating, at least in principle, some natural law. Thirdly, there is no puzzle of human agency. The kind of free will that Reitan wants simply doesn't exist. According to his earlier definition of superstition, empirically testable, against known scientific understanding, without sufficient evidence, belief in libertarian free will is superstition. There's no reason to suspect that human choices aren't subject to the same natural laws that everything else is. Lastly, Reitan just throws in the existence of a soul here as if that isn't itself a controversial claim that needs justification. He's not yet started presenting evidence that a God exists, and he's already positing the existence of some transcendent soul as if that's no big deal. Reitan isn't interested in defending any of these ideas. Instead, he moves on to arguing that transcendent explanations for why things have occurred are not scientifically testable. His contention is that, like with the Virgin Mary and the chocolate, even if we have a complete account of some event that does not include God, that doesn't rule out God's hand in it. I rather think it does, but I'll come to that later. The rest of the section is Reitan explaining that his God of the chance gaps idea is not a God of the gaps argument, which is correct, and again claiming that quantum mechanics establishes that the cause of random events must be transcendent, which is false. In there, he also slips in an admonishment to scientists that they would be well advised to remain silent about God's existence, since they can't plumb the mind of God. Frankly, it's such a typical apologetics move and out of character for Reitan that I was surprised to find it here. Reitan summarises this section with this. If there is a God, there is no good reason to think he would create a universe that couldn't run on its own according to discoverable laws. But such a world is still a world in which God might be a nanosecond by nanosecond participant in events. It remains a world in which God might exert significant influence, both by establishing the initial rules and conditions and by working through the chance gaps. It seems that in order to think that God would create an orderly universe, you would have to plumb the mind of God, but perhaps Reitan can actually do that. And while I agree that a sufficiently powerful being could determine the course of events by setting the initial conditions of creation, I disagree that there are chance gaps in the sense that Reitan means. A meaningful God. This section is an extended discussion of some of the objections to the brains in a vat scenario that could be levelled at Reitan's arguments about transcendent reality. I'm not going to cover it in depth because this chapter is long enough as it is, and I think there are stronger objections. The first objection covered here is philosopher Hilary Putnam's idea that the brain in a vat can't meaningfully refer to being a brain in a vat. That is, for those of us in the empirical world, we can only meaningfully talk about things in the empirical world, as we have no grounding for transcendent concepts. For example, when I say God, that concept is hopelessly stuck in my limited human understanding, and therefore cannot actually refer to a transcendent God. Reitan's response, which I agree with, is that we can talk about transcendent reality by use of metaphor, or other indirect attempts to hint at it. The other objection to the brain in a vat scenario is that, essentially, an unfalsifiable claim is a meaningless claim. That is, if there is no way we can know the difference, then how can it possibly matter? Taken further, is there really any difference if the two are indistinguishable? Reitan answers this objection by saying that this about religious claims about transcendent reality. They posit the existence of a transcendent reality beyond the world encountered through the senses, and they say some things about that reality, even if the language they use has a non-literal meaning. The brains in vats scenario shows us that the idea of a transcendent reality is hardly incoherent. And while we may be able to talk about such a reality only in non-literal terms, we'd still be talking about it. And what we have to say can still fit, or fail to fit, with the way things really are, even if it may be impossible to know how good a fit we've achieved. Reitan goes on to say that he agrees that for claims about transcendent reality to be meaningful, they must also have significance in the empirical world. On this I agree. Reitan then goes on to claim that the significance that religious beliefs have to events in the empirical world is by giving meaning to them. The meaning of life. This next section starts with Reitan talking about meaning. He introduces an example of someone playing pool, striking the white ball with the cue, which then hits the 8 ball into a corner pocket. Science, Reitan says, can tell us everything about the mechanics of this sequence of events, but it cannot give us an account of the meaning of these events. He puts it like this. Nowhere in this explanation would we find the following ordinary account of what happened. The pool player intended to put the 8 ball in the corner pocket because she wanted to win the game. That is a different kind of explanation. It explains not the causal mechanisms whereby the events occurred, but the purposes behind them. The problem here is that science does give us exactly these kinds of accounts. It's just that Reitan has confused science with physics. To get accounts of meaning and purpose, you simply need to turn to the sciences of psychology, sociology, or anthropology. These kinds of accounts are exactly what you find from anthropologists documenting cultural practices. And if pool was an exotic sport played in an undeveloped country, we would have had plenty of scientific accounts like this. Reitan, though, wants to carve out human experiences as unable to be studied scientifically. So he goes on to argue that if we try, we will end up stripping the universe of meaning. He is right, but not in the way that he thinks. Yes, science has shown the universe to be meaningless, but only because it just happens that all meaning seems to come from people. It need not have been that way, but that's the way it seems to be. To argue otherwise, Reitan would need evidence. Reitan's contention is that religion tells us that the universe is not meaningless, that there is purpose beyond our own, and that this is the kind of explanations that religion gives. He puts it like this. But when religion offers purposive explanations for what we encounter in experience, it is not competing with science. It is offering a different kind of explanation about which science has, in principle, nothing to say. This may have been what Gould was trying to say when, in articulating his Noma thesis, he claimed that religion extends over questions of ultimate meaning and moral value. Reitan's point here is that because his religion doesn't stray into the territory of science, despite him suggesting to the contrary this chapter, science can't disprove his religion. This, he thinks, puts his religion in a different category to ideas like Russell's teapot. The problem is that it doesn't. Russell's teapot, although perhaps not optimally constructed for this purpose, is as unfalsifiable as Reitan's God. That's the point of it. Russell's teapot cannot be empirically disproven, and neither can Reitan's God. And Russell's teapot's existence is irrelevant to us, and so is Reitan's God. Concluding remarks. Reitan's summary of this chapter is that, by his definition, science cannot adjudicate the existence of a transcendent reality. His definition of a transcendent being is one that is immune to scientific investigation. Reitan puts it like this. These insights go a long way towards refuting the claim that the absence of scientific evidence for God's existence gives us reason to disbelieve. But the absence of such evidence surely doesn't provide any reason to believe either. At best, we are pointed towards agnosticism, unless of course we have resources other than science. He is using agnosticism to mean the position halfway between belief that God exists and belief that he doesn't. This is the position that many atheists identify with, so on Reitan's account, he has got us to weak atheism, a lack of belief. He promises that in the next chapter he will present philosophical reasons to believe. Again, he claims that, although his philosophical arguments don't compel us to theism, they do make such a position reasonable. I'll wait and see. And that's it for this chapter. I've put off my main criticism of Reitan's position, and I'll explain it now. In order to avoid having his God be falsified by science, Reitan has tried to define his beliefs in such a way that they are unfalsifiable. There are, however, two problems with how he's done that. Firstly, he still wants his God to be able to influence events in reality through his God of the chance gaps idea. But either God shifts the probability of these events away from our naturalistic expectation, or he doesn't. If he does, say by making children recover from leukemia more than we would expect, then this is empirically testable. No matter how small an influence he has, it is still, in principle, scientifically verifiable, and yet we've never found credible evidence of this. So we must conclude that whatever influence God has, it doesn't translate into any actual changes in the probabilities. Which is like claiming that every time I win at roulette, it's because God has affected the outcome. It's adding a supernatural, transcendent explanation where none is warranted. The other problem, which is a more fundamental reflection of the first, is that a God that is immune to empirical testing is ineffective. To see this, consider what is meant by something being empirically testable. We simply mean that it has some effect in the empirical, that is, real world. Empirical testing is just looking for evidence in the world of something's effect. So if God cannot be tested this way, he cannot have an effect in the world. Either he cures cancer sometimes, or he doesn't. If he does, we can test it. If he doesn't, then he's irrelevant. And as irrelevant as Russell's teapot. One trick that I suspect Reitan will use is to try and remove humans from the empirical world. That is to say that people, or minds, or souls are outside of ordinary reality, and hence, God can interact with them without being empirically testable. But this also fails, as this just pushes the problem back a step. If our souls are transcendent, then do they have an effect on the physical part of us? If so, then this is empirically testable. If not, then they are irrelevant. As far as I'm aware, there's simply no gap between being falsifiable and irrelevant, in which God can reside. Anyway, that's it for this chapter. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know what you think in the comments, and let me know if I've missed anything. Join me next time for Chapter 5, Philosophy and God's Existence, Part 1. Until next time, see ya.